Sabai and I just released a VIP of our track Save You on Monstercat. So the original track sits at 90 beats per minute, it's halftime, melodic bass, melodic dubstep, feature bass, whatever you want to call it. So with this VIP, we wanted to make it drum and bass, but I really didn't want to change too much. So a lot of the synths and instruments are pretty much identical to the original.
Second guessing every shot. I won't lie. No, I won't lie. I'm free, but now I'm lost.
So almost all of that's pretty much the same as the original. So where things really change is the drums and the bass, making it a drum and bass remix. So many of the basses in this track are really just based around this one simple bass sound right here. It's a very simple sort of distorted growl sound. Let's check it out. So let's turn the processing off. So we're looking at just the wavetables here, and you'll see it's really basic shapes. Let's even take the distortion off. So what it is it's a sine wave with a high octave sine wave. So we have our sub oscillator, we have a high sine wave, and that sine wave also has a sync value up here. So not a nice sound at all. So all the characters coming from this quantized distortion radically changes the sound. It's this super digital distortion. Normally I wouldn't find that super appealing, but in this case, that's what I went with. Now let's talk about the processing. So we need to get some movement out of this sound. As you can see, all these different modulators here are going to start moving things. So a little bit of volume movement right off the bat, and then add in some fold back distortion where the drive sweeps. Now check this out, if the bias hadn't been there, the sound's very smooth, it's very full, but moving the bias over just a little bit, so we're processing different parts of the cycle a little differently, you start to get this grit, you get this texture, because as you're distorting different parts of the cycle differently, you're hearing distortion at that low sub rattle rate. So that gets a lot of that texture out of the sound. Playing with bias on distortions can really start to bring out buzz, and I'm a big fan of buzzy sounds. Some people like them smooth, I like them buzzy. Faturator here, what I like about Faturator, it's a distortion, but if you move this color, to me it sounds like you're moving sort of a all pass. You've got a bit of a resonant peak moving through the sound, at least that's what it sounds like to me. I'm sure there's more to it, but that allows you to add a bit more like vowelyness to the sound. Without it. So you're getting more of like ow, 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 sort of that I-O-O sort of timbre over top. And then nonlinear filter. I love kilohertz nonlinear filter, especially this biased mode. Remember how a second ago I was talking about bias, how bias allows you to get a bit more buzz out of the sound? Well, this bias filter mode is buzz central. Check this out. If this was the clean distortion, just a clean notch going through the sound. Let's check out the bias distortion. Come on. It's got some nice movement in it. Oh, and then more bias distortion at the end. So yeah, it's just over the top crunchy, and I love that. Now you'll notice too, the sound sounds very spacey. But you don't want reverb running over top of your basses the whole time. It can kind of wash it out. So just notice how I like to automate that over time too, where the tail end of the sound can spray out a bit more, so it's not like the whole thing is super wet. After that, not much processing, some overdrive. So lots of subtle layers of distortion added on top of sine waves over and over and over until you get a nice unique sound. Now, on the replies, I've got a lot of neuro-esque basses. I wouldn't quite call them neuro basses, but that's what I call them. So let's check it out. I turn off this morph EQ because this is going to be a significant part of the sound, but let's listen to it. So it's not really neuro-y at all. I mean, it is in the sense you kind of have a saw wave with some unison, but it's getting more squarey digital distortion territory using more of this quantized feature. And the rest of the processing is pretty similar to that previous patch. So this must be based off that previous patch. Pretty simple. But what adds movement to the sound is this morph EQ. So this morph EQ by Minimal Audio is really nice, where it's an EQ where you can add tons of different filter points, and each filter point you can control where it goes, how the cue changes, etc., which can have insane movement results in a sound. Check this out. So it just goes from no real vowel sound. So there you go, morph EQ, absolute beauty. And throughout the song, all the neurobasses are variants of that. This one's a higher octave, for example, with movement from auto pan, but otherwise same sound. Now it's not till the last drop where the basses start to change, so let's look at some of the later basses on the last drop here. So these basses are all sort of clones and alternates of each other. So let's look at the main one here. So this is the plain patch here. It's not too pleasant a sound, but what I liked about it was that movement, that yo yo yo, yo yo yo. And that is actually coming entirely from detune. So if we check out this sound and we don't have this unison on here, sort of just a big horn type sound. Now let me turn it on. So what's happening here with the unison is I have it on hard mode. Hard mode means that all of the phases start the same and then they start to detune and spread out over time. So you have really direct control of the results because it's always going to be the same. So as the sound progresses, the detune increases. As the detune increases, the phasing between the different cycles create that wobble sound. And you'll notice all these basses are really basic wave shapes. It's all about the processing. This quantized distortion all over this song. Formant filter. Now I love this formant filter. I'm going to turn up the Q so you can really hear it. So it's just creating these formant resonant peaks in the sound so you can really just get more vowel movement out of the sound. And to me, that's what I love about basses, when you can kind of mouth along and hear the pattern. And then the processing is all the same. To keep a cohesive track, for me, it's all about taking a sound, duplicating it, varying it, duplicating it, varying it, duplicating it, varying it, until you have a whole whack of basses that are all interrelated, but still different from one another at the same time. And honestly, that's it for the basses. There's not too much else to them. This wouldn't be a drum and bass track without drums. The drums are quite simple in terms of their pattern and really the amount of drums, but they're really clean, they're really tight. That's all I wanted it to be. The song's more of a focus on the original vocal, the original melodies, the new basses, and the drums for me didn't need to be as insane. So they're pretty simple. What's important in drum and bass for me is having the drums be really clear, tight, but also not too dominant. You don't want them super long. They have to be short. So these samples are pretty short, and you'll notice even at times I shorten the sample even further. Look how long this original kick sample is. Goes all the way out to here compared to this cross-faded version I had. So what I did is I shortened the sample, I faded it as cleanly as possible. You'll notice if I remove the crossfade, okay, I didn't line it up perfectly, but a bit of crossfade cleans it up. But you want to try and line up those phases as much as possible to keep that nice original pitch if you are going to cut out a middle of the kick and make it shorter. So there's different kick lengths too. There's shorter versions, there's the full length kick. Really short little version here. And so having all these different variations can just help with feel. I find if you have just the same kick and it's the same length and it's the same intensity, it doesn't have as much human feel to it. So I like to have variation in the kick in that sense. And then processing, very, very simple. A little bit of cleanup, some transient design. This is pretty important. So the Neutron transient designer, I like it because it's multi-band. I like it because when you turn it on, the lows, the mids, and the highs all suck down really quick, while getting more punch out of these individual bands. And then of course, standard clip at the end. Now the snare, on the other hand, has a bit more to it. Not a ton more, but just a little bit more layered. So this is my snare. Pretty simple, pretty tight. So I'm gonna turn off all the processing and let's just take it layer by layer. So we've got the snare bottom one. So this is just a filtered snare and I'm bringing out that root harmonic in the sound. So I just really liked the bottom of this snare sound. This is a Mr. Bill one, I believe, from his Spectra pack. And then I've got a chime snare, which is acting as just kind of a piffy top end. I say piffy like a pff, pff sort of top end. But you'll notice that I'm not getting the transient from this. I'm using spiff to cut the transient, so it's actually less punchy. For this, it's all about the tail. So this one's all about the tail. So we got our bottom, we got our tail. And then we've got a noisiest snare here, which is a very subtle clap layer. And you'll notice this one too, I've also taken out the transient, this time using a gate. And what's nice is if you gate a piece of percussion and you increase the attack time, you're pretty much allowing the sound to fade in and add attack, a slow attack to a sound that may not have had one. So that's also just a bit of texture. We've got a Cohen sound snare. I love that Mr. Bill noisy chime Cohen sound. I'm bringing out all the big boy snares on this one. A really weird texture. I don't even know why that's in there. I can barely hear it, but hey, I felt at the time that was right. And then our snap, our transient. It's just a really subtle knock. And if we play them all together, it's nice. It's not a bad snare. But what matters is the processing. First, drum bus. Wow, that changes everything. That snare sucks. That snare rocks. I like that. Now this is a bit controversial. I'm sorry for anyone that has to see this. I've got a disperser on my snare. I thought, I guess, at the time, that this snare was too percussive, too transient heavy. So I used disperser on the root note up in the top end to kind of smear the sound. Do not recommend this. This is really bad. But for whatever reason, I guess I was trying transient designers and they weren't getting the result I wanted. And I thought maybe disperser would. It just smooths it out a little bit. In retrospect, probably sounds worse, but you know what? At the time, that's what felt better. We've got EQ, we've got spiff, adding more transient. So notice how sometimes I'll take some out, add some in, until we get the right sound. Soothe, cleaning up some top end. More transient design. More transient design. Cutting it again. I don't know why. Sometimes less is more. In this case, there was an interplay between adding and removing and adding and removing until we ended up with the perfect one. And then clipping again at the end. Let's turn all this off. See that without all those different levels of transient and volume design? It's not bad. It's got a nice like representation of the frequency spectrum. But that's just nice and tight. So that's the snare. It was a little bit more involved than the kick drum, but that's it. The drums are pretty basic beyond that. You know, I do think in drum and bass it is important to have really good drums, but I also have to acknowledge when a song's really bright, all the basses are bright, you don't want your song to be too dense with rhythm, and at least I didn't. So in this song, I opted to let the bass focus more than the drums. Beyond that, a couple things I want to show you. I just want to show you that the sub is a little bit of work. So what I like to do is I'll often write my sub line and I'll call it like a sub source. But then I will go in and I will manually chop my sub so that it fades out of the way of the kick and it matches the bass pattern as closely as possible. This is all about feel. This allows me to do weird things too, where I can like change the volume of certain moments, fade it so when the next kick comes in, there's a bit more impact. Notice how all these basses fade out, so they kind of match the shape of the wobbles a little more. Sometimes I'll go into a song and I'll do stuff like this to every element to make it super tight. Sometimes I don't feel it's necessary, but certain elements like the sub, I almost always think is necessary. The only thing is you really want to make sure you are happy with your sub pattern, you're happy with your sub melody. So this is kind of one of the last stages before I start a real mix down, is more of the chopping and fading and manual editing. If we take the old elements and then we put the new drums and the new bass under it, we get this. So there we go. That was a little peek under the hood for Sabai and I's new VIP of our old track, Save You. I hope you learned something from this video. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. And I'll be back soon with another video.